My name is Christine Gordon and I help organise some of the events for Readings. On behalf of Readings, on behalf of Alan and Unwin, on behalf of the Nova Theatre, tonight it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Clive Hamilton. Clive is a director and former executive director of the Australian Institute, a self-described progressive Australian think tank. In June this year, he was appointed to the newly created Vice-Chancellor's Chair at Charles Sturt University and has joined the Centre for Applied Philosophy and Public Ethics as Professor of Public Ethics. He is an advocate of sustainable development and social and economic equality. Hamilton has published and does comment on a range of environmental, social and economic issues and regularly appears in the Australian media. He offers a critique of modern capitalism and consumerism and is critical of the absence of debate within the major political parties of free markets, social inequality, the roots of unsustainable development and the power of multinational corporations. He is the author of Growth Fetish, Scorcher, Silencing Dissent and Freedom Paradox. Tonight he will be talking about the Freedom Paradox. Again, I hope you enjoy tonight and thank you so much for coming. Cheers.
Thanks very much, Chris, for that introduction, and to Readings for hosting the event, and to you all, of course, for coming out on this very Canberra evening. Well, in the preface to the Freedom Paradox, I say that I wrote the book to answer the question of why it is that despite the wealth and freedom enjoyed by most citizens of affluent countries like Australia, we do not appear to be the autonomous, fulfilled, creative individuals that we were promised that our wealth and freedom would bring to us. And if the premise of that question is true, and I think it is, it represents a sharp rebuke to the neoliberals who promised us nirvana if only we would agree to set markets free. I mean, it's true that the neoliberals have been highly successful on their own terms. The economy has done very well over the last, particularly 15 years since the last recession. We have entered into this era of affluenza, as it's sometimes called. But we were implicitly promised so much more than high incomes and greater consumption opportunities. The intellectual wellspring of neoliberalism, Friedrich von Hayek, predicted that today we would be celebrating a new sense of power over our own fate, the belief in the unbounded possibilities of improving our own lot. Sadly for him, the facts would not collaborate, and they show that we feel less control over our world than 40 years ago. So we look around in vain for the creative, flourishing souls at ease in their own skins and fulfilling their own destinies. Instead, I think we see societies affluent but anxious, peopled by those who've won their freedoms but are not sure what to do with them. But our current predicament is also an embarrassment for the leaders of the liberation movements of the 60s and 70s. Of course, it was necessary to sweep away the weight of prejudice, patriarchy and Victorian morality that oppressed various minorities and women. But the social movements too promised so much more. The sexual revolution, for instance, promised that if we freed sexuality from emotional entanglements and moral limitations, a new world of uninhibited erotic pleasure would open up before us. The counterculture promised liberation from the conformity and materialism of the American dream, unable then to see that its revolt against convention would in fact sweep away the social conservatism that held capitalism back. In the Freedom Paradox, my answer to the question of why freedom from economic, political and social constraints failed to bring about human flourishing lies in the absence of another form of freedom, inner freedom. Inner freedom can be defined as the extent to which a person is guided in his actions by his own considered will, by his own considered will, by his reason or lasting conviction, rather than by momentary impulse or circumstance. Now, it's ironic that the definition I've just quoted was penned by Hayek himself, the godfather of neoliberalism and free market ideology. And it's ironic because I argue that the theft of our inner freedom is the dominant characteristic of modern consumer society, where the cultivation of momentary impulse is not simply a byproduct of the system, but is essential to its day-to-day reproduction. It seems to me that the most important sociological question we confront today is why we choose to be unfree. If, as Rosa Luxemburg once wrote, freedom is always and exclusively freedom for the one who thinks differently, why do so few do it? And by posing this question, we're compelled to go beyond analysis of social and cultural forms to deeper metaphysical questions. And so I wrote the book because I wanted some answers to the ultimate questions, the magnificent questions that humans have always posed for themselves. What's the nature of our being? Are we trapped in our everyday perceptions? Why should we behave morally? Are we saved or condemned by our rationality? And I look around for guidance on these questions, for the thinkers, the philosophers, or the organisations that might point me to fertile pastures. But all I can find are rationalist philosophers, fervent atheists, moribund churches, and crazy fundamentalists. In the history of the species, we've reached a point where to ask why we are here and to attempt to confront our own being invites ridicule. We communicate with each other more than ever before. I read that social networkers on the web are now complaining that they're too connected and have to send messages to their friends to stop telling them what they're having for dinner. But beneath the endless babble, in truth, a great silence has descended over us. In Western civilization's retreat to the superficial, we've not simply ignored the deeper realms, but invalidated them. The wisdom is no longer handed down. The esoteric is mocked by the shallow. And the conundrum of being is everywhere resolved by more frenetic doing. Well, I blame Jean-Paul Sartre for this dire state of affairs. At least to the extent that we can blame an individual, he's as guilty as anyone. In October 1945, 4 months after the end of the European War and a few weeks after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Sartre gave a famous lecture to a packed hall in Paris. Titled "Existentialism is a Humanism," it signalled a new era and defined the mood of a generation. Existentialism is a humanism, Sartre argued, because man must always fall back on himself. There's nowhere else to go. The humanism of existentialism is not that form of humanism which upholds man as an end in itself, the embodiment of some supreme value, because for Sartre, man is always unfinished, still to be defined, a work in progress. The realisation of man as truly human can only ever be the endeavour of man himself, he argued. There is no external legislator, no universe except that of human subjectivity. It's in this sense that existentialism is a humanism. Well, in this bleak and alienating humanist vision, Sartre abandoned not just forms of consciousness beyond everyday rationality, but all metaphysics. The profound questions of being, of morality, of human purpose beyond the mundane were disallowed, in his view. Perhaps we could have expected no more in a generation that endured Auschwitz, an event that seems to admit only two possible moods, despair and abandon. Little wonder Sartre at the time was criticised as a counsellor of despair and solitariness, and he was reproached for emphasising all that is mean and sordid in the human condition. Sartre's philosophical subjectivity developed over the decades into an all-encompassing narcissism, particularly once the death of ideology liberated us from the obligation to care about others and the larger world. It's the situation Sartre feared his existentialism would lead to, but which could lead nowhere else. The repudiation of the transcendent provided the excuse for postmodern nihilism, a philosophical wasteland perfectly suited to a social formation defined by the emptiness of affluence. I think the secret of Sartre's urge to collapse the transcendent into the mundane can be traced to his famous confrontation with the root of a chestnut tree in his novel Nausea, published in 1938. After a long period in the novel marked by feelings of intense alienation and suicidal thoughts, the protagonist, Roquentin, surely the author himself, finds himself in a municipal park in a provincial French town where, sitting on a bench, he is suddenly overwhelmed by the quiddity of the things around him. He wrote, "And suddenly the veil is torn away. I have understood. I have seen. Then I had this vision. It left me breathless. Never until these last few days had I understood the meaning of existence. Usually existence hides itself, and then all of a sudden, there it was. Clear as day, existence had suddenly unveiled itself. It had lost the harmless look of an abstract category. It was the very paste of things. This root was kneaded into existence." So Roquentin is poleaxed by reality in this scene, invaded by existence itself in an experience of merger. The abyss opened up before him, but at the critical moment, he balks and then recoils from it. Instead of accepting the experience as a precious gift, he denies it and flees. Well, how did Sartre understand the meaning of the existence that was unveiled before him? Well, he mistook that which was cleared away to reveal being for being itself. I mean, essentially, he saw nothingness. In Sartre's existentialism, being has no cause, purpose, or explanation. It has no meaning. Our existence, he wrote, is de trop, superfluous. The first principle of existentialism, he declared in his 1945 lecture, is that man is nothing else but that which he makes of himself. Nothing underpins our existence. We are no more than the sum of our acts, our subjectivity. In short, our existence is absurd. Sartre's existentialism was, in the precise words of Slavoj Žižek, the pessimistic wisdom of the failed encounter. Heidegger, Sartre's teacher, protested that humanism, as understood by existentialism, does not set the humanity of man high enough. But an exhausted and cynical world wanted Sartre's message. By denying metaphysics, Sartre initiated the era of the Great Silence, where it became de rigueur to repudiate that which could give us our true dignity, our humanitas. Since then, the Great Silence has been filled by the empty chatter of the postmodernists, who were provided a justification by the French post-structuralists, who attacked not just absolute truths, as Sartre had, but truth as such. Postmodernism's essential historical function has been to depoliticise a generation of students and to legitimise the trivial through vehicles such as cultural studies. If there's only subjectivity, we're always prisoners of our own conditions, of language, of context. In his Paris lecture, Sartre declared that existentialists find it extremely embarrassing that God does not exist, because then there's no alternative but to repudiate all forms of moral authority. Man is free to choose any moral rules or none by which to live. And he recounted the story of a pupil who approached him for advice during the war. The pupil lived alone with his mother after his father had left home to become a collaborator with the Nazi occupiers, and his brother had been killed by the Nazis. And he had to choose to stay with his mother, for whom he was the only consolation in life, or to go abroad to join the Free French forces and fight the Nazis and avenge his brother. Now, no moral doctrine could help this pupil make a decision, and Sartre himself was at a loss, telling the student that he's on his own. This type of situation, common in life, although perhaps not with that extreme condition, demands a moral decision where there can be no rules to guide us. We may seek advice from others, as the pupil unsuccessfully did from his professor, but others can only illuminate our choices, not make them. In the end, it's a decision that must be left to our own inner judge, and it's to that court, ruled by our own inner judge, that we must go in order to find the right thing to do. Sartre's anguished pupil actually knew this and said to Sartre, "In the end, it's feeling that counts. The direction in which it is really pushing me is the one I ought to choose." But Sartre dismissed this too. Feeling can't be estimated, he said. There is no internal weighting of options that can guide you. In Sartre's world, not only is there no external guide, nor is there ever any authentic internal voice. There's nothing. But, he warns us, whatever you choose, you must take full responsibility. Otherwise, Jean-Paul will accuse you of bad faith. Well, Sartre's pupil was appealing intuitively to what, in the freedom paradox, I call the moral self. It was Arthur Schopenhauer's great insight to recognise that all humans have at their core the same inner nature, the universal self, or, as the Eastern traditions sometimes call it, the subtle part. In those moments when the distinction between subject and object seems to dissolve, the participation of the self in others leads us to recognise in them our own inner nature. This metaphysical empathy, as I call it, forms the grounds of all morality and is the basis of the moral self. So the moral self is the innermost voice of conscience, where all personal interests, social conventions, duties and obligations have been left behind. So unlike in the moral systems of rationalist philosophers such as Kant and John Rawls and Rousseau, when we, in contrast to their view, we don't, when we have fallen short of our ethical standards, cry out, "I have acted against a maxim that should serve as universal law." We don't believe that we've contravened an agreement reached behind the veil of ignorance. We don't bewail the fact that we've breached a social contract somehow written in invisible ink. No, when we've let ourselves down, that's exactly what we say we've done. I've gone against my own better judgment, my own better nature. And that better nature that we refer to is the moral self, the arbiter, the inner judge, who speaks to us with an immediacy and authority that no maxim, legislation, contract or ecclesiastical authority can possess. Those who deny their moral selves are alienated from the universal self that joins us all, and the further we drift from our moral selves, the less human we become. After all, that's why evil acts are called inhuman. And when we appeal to the good, we appeal to people's humanity. So the moral self is the fixed point which moral relativism could never find. The root point that transcends the conditions of all communities, societies and religions. As Schopenhauer wrote, all genuine virtue proceeds from the immediate and intuitive knowledge of the metaphysical identity of all things. Well, if existentialism did not set our humanity high enough, as Heidegger said, at least it allowed us to make our own truth. It may have killed the transcendental subject, but that still left the subject of everyday action. For the post-structuralists, existentialism was guilty of an excess of subjectivity, and they set out to deny us even that residue. In the vision of its most important figure, Michel Foucault, we're completely cut adrift. There are no origins, only accidents. History has no narrative, but is merely a series of episodes. There is no knowledge, only a variety of perspectives. Sartre allowed us to strive for an authentic self, but Foucault insisted the self can have no coherent grounding. It's no more than a unity of accidents, a network which doesn't even form a pattern. He wrote, "Nothing in man, not even his body, is sufficiently stable to serve as the basis for self-recognition or for understanding other men. Even our freedom is an illusion," he claimed. "Liberty is an invention of the ruling class, and domination can only be defeated by another form of domination." It's this Nietzschean view of history, of man as a species always at war, that, of course, appealed so much to fascists. After all, it was Mussolini who wrote, "We have buried the putrid corpse of liberty,"